You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library podcast, March 29th, 2022.
Everybody saying the word is going to make a difference in how people think about Native people and how they think about us. Because the default is was, were.
Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library podcast, where we interview authors, artists, and other notable people from Chicagoland and around the world. I'm Dylan Zavagno, the Adult Services Coordinator at the library. This month, we are honored to welcome as our guest Dr. Debbie Reese, a tribally enrolled Nambe Pueblo author and scholar. Dr. Reese is best known for her popular blog, American Indians in Children's Literature, which provides critical analysis of Indigenous peoples in children's and young adult books. Our conversation offers an introduction to Dr. Reese and her work, which many librarians, teachers, parents, authors, and others consult to evaluate books by and about Native people, who are often underrepresented and misrepresented in literature. As Dr. Reese tells us, these types of misrepresentations in children's literature, including stereotypes, omissions, and inaccuracies, come at a great cost to both Native and non-Native readers. Dr. Reese is also the co-adapter with Dr. Jean Mendoza of An Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young People, originally by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. That's from Beacon Press. We spend some time discussing the ways in which Drs. Reese and Mendoza adapted the often disturbing and violent history of the United States from a Native perspective, a perspective that is often left out of U.S. history books and classrooms. An Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young People has recently appeared on several lists of books that some want banned or removed from school and public libraries. We hear Dr. Reese's perspective on why books like hers are being challenged. Finally, we couldn't pass up the opportunity to highlight just a few of the many wonderful books by contemporary Native authors we have in our collection. Listen to the end of our conversation for some great recommendations of recent books for a wide range of readers. Here's my conversation with Dr. Debbie Reese. I'm so honored to welcome you on our podcast, Debbie. I have to say, I first became aware of your work around a decade ago when I was in teaching school. You're sort of a celebrity to me. Your blog, American Indians in Children's Literature, has been an invaluable resource for those of us thinking about education and book selection in schools and library services. Of course, this goes beyond just analyzing children's literature. There's tons of original work on classroom activities, on book awards, Native issues in general. So can you just introduce yourself to our audience and talk about how you got involved in this work?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me. I could say kunta, which is the Tewa word for thank you, so I'll say that too, kunta. Dylan, I'm glad to be here. I started out in life as a bossy oldest sister who made my younger siblings play school. I liked school so much that's what we played. When I got home from first grade, I got all my little siblings together and I was the teacher. So I liked that idea of educating for, I guess, like over 60 years now. So I went on to college and got a teaching degree and then was teaching. I also like learning very much. So I was going to go to graduate school and that ended up being the University of Illinois that had a mascot, and I was going to study family literacy, but I got here, I'm like, what is wrong here? Why do these people think this way? And it was just upsetting in so many ways how people seem to like reject me as a real Native person in favor of a fiction, a fantasy, a thing that they loved. It was just the embodiment of every stereotype that exists about Native people. And they would argue that, yeah, but we honor you. And I said, no, honor means you listen and you respect. And I don't feel listened to or respected when I was speaking to students and people in the community about that mascot. So anyway, I continued to be interested in children's books. And so I started studying representation. I started looking carefully at images and books to try to understand why people were so caught up by that imagery. And I saw Clifford the Big Red Dog in his Halloween costume and the Berenstain Bears, Grizzly Bob. As I started looking, I saw all of these figures in children's literature that are given to us by people who care about us. So they come to us in a very emotionally laden way. And then when someone says, wait, suddenly you're in this space, but like, yeah, I mean, not consciously. I don't think anybody's consciously thinking, well, my mom gave me that book. But there's dissonance happening in the recipient when they are asked to think about an image that they have not thought critically about before. So I started looking at images and thinking about that, and how many of and it was just sad. There were and are so many stereotypical images of Native people in children's books and the media, Halloween costumes. It's kind of like everywhere you turn. So anyway, I started studying representations in children's books, and then finished my degree, got my PhD, and started teaching at the University of Illinois in the first American Indian Studies program, and realizing that, you know what, all these things that I'm publishing, they're behind paywalls. Teachers and librarians, having been a former school teacher, I could never afford to join those associations. All the money I had went to buying books and crayons. So I decided I had to address that, and that's when I created my blog, so that there's no paywall there, and all the work that ends up on my blog is written in friendlier ways too. I think I try to be very straight and very honest and very direct. You won't find any of that jargon that academics have to use, because I don't like that stuff anyway. It's a barrier to communication, and I'm trying to remove barriers. So anyway, that's the reason the blog is written the way it is, and that's why it's there for real people. Not that academics aren't real people, but they do tend to be in isolated, bubbly spaces that are kind of troubling.
I wanted to ask you a couple things at the start here. One was just what I've noticed from several talks of yours is what you just did is sort of centering our emotional attachments. I'm wondering about this nostalgia that people have and this connection that non-native people have to some of these images. And I think I've seen you bring that up, and it's sort of like to put it out on the table, right? Like, let's put this out here that we have these strong emotions about it and not try to hide that aspect of it.
Yeah, I guess I think that I have strong reactions as a parent, as a mother who raised a child in a very hostile environment. And it wasn't just the mascot, but it was the books that she had in school and in the assigned lessons and things that she was asked to do. We are caught in a very emotionally charged space just by existing. And it seems sometimes you can get in big arguments with people, but it seems to me that if maybe this is good that you're pushing me to think about this, but what do we bring to the table, each one of us? Me, a Native woman who grew up on a reservation, very much immersed in our ways, and you, a white person who grew up in an entirely different space, you have emotions in your lived experience too. And it would be so easy for me to just beat up on the yous of the world. And sometimes I do, sometimes that comes out. But what I think I try to do in a measured way is to acknowledge your humanity too, with the hopes that we meet on that space of acknowledging our humanity.
Yeah. Well, I had a little example here of what I think a lot of the non-native library professionals and teachers that I've talked to who use your blog, I had sort of this experience. So I went and I was grabbing all of these different books by authors from all these different Native nations, and I just grabbed a book that looked like a Native book, because it was by an author named Smith, and it was behind Cynthia LaTeach Smith. And that book was Arctic White by Dana Smith. And I read this book, and I said, oh, that's a nice picture book. It's about a child and her father, and they're going to go see the Northern Lights. And I thought, this wasn't on a list from Debbie, so I'm going to look up on her blog, is there something about it? And there was a little thing. It wasn't a big thing. But it said, well, here's a review somebody wrote. It's not a Native author, And it looks like there's several inaccuracies there, people living in igloos that might not live in igloos. And instead, you can choose a book like Sky Sisters. And it was so nice to have that alternative. And then I picked up Sky Sisters, and it's a very similar story. It's two sisters going out to see the Northern Lights. But I sort of, instantly, even though I don't have all the background knowledge as a white reader, I knew that there was more authenticity here and a feeling of, reality happening in this book. So that was one example of how I think I've used your blog and maybe other people have. Is this sort of what you have in mind for some of your blog posts?
Well, a lot of the blog posts are there because a librarian or a parent or a teacher wrote to me and said, Debbie, can you take a look at this book? So I don't remember that one you held up Arctic White in particular, but it could be one of those. And I said, I'd look into it, but here's what I know so far. Because I'm trying to have a conversation about the book because I don't know everything and I don't know every author. And so it's a process for me too. And so I think laying out my own process as I'm doing that can help people learn from that process. I like hearing you say that as you read Sky Sisters, you felt different about it. And I think that can only come from having read other books by Native writers so that you are internalizing what that would be like. You still see the Barbara Juicy book all over the place.
Is it Mama, Do You Love Me?
Yes, Mama, Do You Love Me? People who read that book without having spent time reading Native writers, they like that book. Yeah. And Native readers look at that book and they're like, oh no. So what you bring to the reading really matters. And when librarians take time, as you have done, to actually read the books, that makes a tremendous difference in what you can do. Because I worry about lists because people will read the list and take the book but not really know the book and know the content, and they're not being. That's not. They have no time. I understand that too, but I also expect people to be learners and read the books, and then that will help them make better choices of what they're going to actually read at story time. They should read Sky Sisters and not the Barbara Juicy book. But I bet if we did a tally, we'd find that more people read that one, Mama, Do You Love Me? And not very many read Sky Sisters.
Yeah. And I think that's what I was wondering about, that the blog is really about educating us to be able to see and read those things for ourselves in a community with other readers. But it's not just, a yes or no.
Well, I do come down with a very hard yes or no sometimes.
Sometimes it is, right. Okay.
But that's honest.
Yeah,
that's honest. Yeah. And I think in a way that gives librarians a heads up. I'm like, this could go this could really get bad for you if you're going to do this anyway. And someone in the audience, because that has happened. Like, I have had people write to me saying, in their emails, their exclamations about having listened to this or that writer and that they started reading from a book that they did that I had given a not recommended to, and they said, have you seen? Yeah, she just doesn't understand. And so those writers will, they know, but they are rebutting it. And it's just a mascot conversation all over again. You just don't get it, Debbie. I like you.
Yeah, this commitment to telling the truth through your work is just very inspiring to me. So I thought we'd talk now about your book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young People. It came out in 2019 from Beacon Press. It was originally a 2014 book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and you adapted it with Dr. Jean Mendoza. Now, when I asked our youth services department what they wanted to ask you, the most frequent question was about the adaptation process. And I'm really fascinated by it too. I sort of read the adult book and the young people's book side by side. And the question that came up was sort of, how do you decide what to include, or more specifically, how did you think about what was appropriate for young readers? But then, of course, the question comes up, appropriate for who?
Yes. And the way that Jean and I talk about that process and what we did was we're both mothers and we both have Native children, and we know what their experiences were with nonfiction. So as we were adapting the book, we had literally their photographs all around us, because we were writing from our homes and thinking about them as we chose the next word to put down on a page. How would they feel reading that? So there was some tension there, because the tension in wanting to be honest, because the history is brutal and it is violent. So we wanted to find that space that let that come through, but also didn't gratuitously hurt a Native child who was reading the book. And so we imagined our kids as the readers and how they might feel about this or that. So that was that part of the process, about what to write and what to leave out, because there was a lot that we left out there, and that was important.
Yeah. Well, I thought just generally I would ask you, I'm sure you're asked this all the time, about, telling this history that's both horrific and very kind of repressed and not talked about and not seen in a lot of school environments. What just is the cost, again, for who are we talking about, or what's the value we're talking about? Well, what's the cost of teaching our kids, white kids, Native kids, kids of other races and ethnicities, stereotypes or half-truths or obfuscations or just plain lies?
The cost is ignorance. I think that when we don't know the truth of what war was and is, then we are too easily able to enter another war in another space. And so, like, the concept of war is not of the past, it's of the present. I mean, we're on that very cusp right now. And so I think if we don't really understand the history fully, then we are, as a society, too easily falling into those same spaces again. And a huge problem with how non-white people are depicted in books. So I'm talking about not just Native people, but non-white people broadly, is they are otherized and made to seem not like me, white person, so that you don't identify with them. So when a people is so easily thought of as other by calling their women squaws rather than women or mom or grandma, then it's easy to go to war against them, or to think less of them, to think they're not like me, so I can do X, Y, and Z to them, or my country can do that to them. So I think we're doing that. I think the United States has never stopped doing that to people. So there's a huge cost.
Well, I really appreciated reading this young person's version, especially all of the kind of sidebars you add and extra definitions, because it doesn't include any prior knowledge. It doesn't assume any prior knowledge. So you sort of get really to the basics of what we're talking about here. So I was just going to read one example of this. This was talking about the phrase ethnic cleansing. And I'll just read this little section here. So again, this kind of like interrupts the history. There's a little gray box in the book. Consider this. You may have heard the term ethnic cleansing in news stories about conflicts in foreign countries. The term came into use during the 20th century. The United Nations has two definitions. And then it gives the definitions. And then you write, bringing a critical lens to words we use is important. Generally speaking, people think of cleansing as a good, the removal of something bad or dirty. But people are not bad, dirty objects that can be removed or done away with without regard for their humanity. The term cleansing hides the motives and actions of powerful governments or groups who are deliberately harming many people. What other terms can you think of that might be more accurate? And that could be a great classroom conversation or a conversation with your kids. And I think it's particularly useful for kind of, again, that young person's version for me as an adult reader was useful for breaking through any sort of lazy thinking. Oh, well, here's a term I can just grab, ethnic cleansing. And that sort of stops the conversation in my mind. Well, I read through something like that and I really think about what does that mean? And clean seems like a good thing. It sort of affected me even more deeply than reading that adult version.
One thing, that adult version is not an easy read. Earlier I was talking about academic jargon, and while there's a lot of that in there, it is also a history that has never been brought to most people before. So, like, for example, when I'm in New York City and I get into a cab and you have a chatty cab driver and they want to talk about you or what you're doing. And I tell them who I am. And it's not just me. This is a commonly shared experience amongst Native people. The cab, you tell them that you're a Native person, and it's like they do they whip that neck around and look to see, because they can't believe it, because they don't know that we still exist. Because so much of what's out there is in the past and the Indian wars, and there's suggestions that we don't exist anymore. So when we were writing the book, we felt it was really important to front load it as much as we could for the teacher who is using the book, who does not have time to go and look things up. And if they did have time, might go right to a problematic Encyclopedia Britannica that has a very white bias. So we wanted to help that teacher, but also young readers who need that information too. So we're trying to present that information in ways that will be helpful as a classroom teacher using the book in the room, but as a reader reading independently as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the fun part. Building in the boxes. And those came from just Jean and I having been teachers and doing workshops with educators for years. We know what the questions are.
It's sort of unforgettable when you hear about George Washington being called by a group of Seneca chiefs town destroyer. And you even bring in Hamilton. You have a box saying, hey, let's talk about Hamilton. This would be something, that musical a lot of kids know, that we could talk about. There's just so many things of kind of takeaways. I hesitate to ask almost like, what are the main takeaways? Because it's in the book. Like, I just would recommend reading the book.
Yeah, I guess I would really like those kind of conversations that it's the entirety of the book is really important. But the thought that you raised about just talking about that one box about ethnic cleansing and those words, those are profound moments. And that little, a half an hour or an hour conversation about just that impacted you. And I think that kids can have that same experience. So I think the takeaway is that a cover-to-cover reading of the book is not necessarily the right path based on who you're working with and how. There might be a more impactful passage or page that you want to look at. Like in Illinois, I want librarians and teachers in Illinois to read the parts about Abraham Lincoln, because those are very powerful. Yeah, we have him on this big pedestal, and yet there's the Dakota people. What happened with them? The largest mass execution. Goodness, everybody should know that. Yeah. Before we move off of the book, and since you have it right there in front of you, turn to the index and look up George Washington.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm turning here. Okay, I see Washington, George, and then in parentheses, Euro-American U.S.
Yeah, that was one of the moments in the book that we had many, but that was one of the moments when we were like, yes, because they had generated the index at Beacon and sent it to us and wanted us to make sure that all of the tribal affiliations for the people in the book that they were indexing were correct. And so we were like going through checking. And then I got to the W page and the people above George Washington's name, that was there. And there was George, and he was like, nothing. and I thought, that's not right. He's not nothing. There is nothing here because he doesn't need an identifier in this USA, United States. He's so central. He's so centered that he doesn't need any kind of identifier. And I thought, nope, we're going to interrupt that too. And so we asked Dr. Dunbar Ortiz, who wrote the original, can we add names? And we talked all about that. what we would use, what were going to be the identifiers. And she did most of that, but the idea was received well. And so there it is. We have that for everybody. And that's new. I don't think any index has done that before. But I think that's another conversation that people could have, because it came from, I don't know if you read Vicki Smith's editorial in Kirkus several years ago. I can't remember the title of it. She was the editor at a time when Kirkus made the shift of identifying the characters. If it was a white person, they were going to say white. And I remember when I first started doing all of this work in the 90s and having these conversations with people in review journal people saying, let's do this for everybody. And they're like, no, that's very clunky. That just does not roll off the tongue. And that's the point. And so here we are.
Yeah, that's the point. Well, that's sort of what I wanted to ask you about now, is that recently this book has been challenged and or banned by some school districts. And you've said that, well, you don't really see any evidence of people reading or engaging with the work. Like sometimes they're just copying and pasting the same critique for every book that they're challenging on their challenge forms. But you've also said that you're not surprised that the book would be challenged. So can you tell us more about why it doesn't surprise you?
Well, what we're seeing in these conversations now, and this is just the recent wave, there have been waves of these, are white folks don't like their vision of the past to be upset. They like to hold on to that nostalgia that we were talking about earlier, that this was a great country with, and it was a place of the American dream where everybody could come and achieve what they wanted. What was left out of that was the realities of stolen land, of slavery, of Japanese incarceration. There's a lot that most people just want to pretend never happened. An honest history about the United States would be challenged. So I'm not surprised that it ended up on those lists. I still want to know, how did it end up on the list? Because clearly to me, nobody's reading it. Because I do absolutely believe that if they did read it, they would be reading aloud from it at school board meetings.
Mm. Well, it's just there in the title. This is an Indigenous people's history. It's not going to be standard white U.S. history.
True.
So you've also talked about Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's concept of windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, but you sort of talked about that with book banning, that maybe parents are worried that a book might be a sliding glass door. Can you maybe introduce listeners to those metaphors, if they don't already know them, of windows, mirrors, sliding glass doors, and how you think that might be functioning here? Dr.
Bishop's metaphor, first time that it was published that I read was like in 1990, 1991. And the idea that that books can function as mirrors or windows. So let's start with a window, because she starts with a window. A window lets you see something. And when she's thinking about windows and books can let you see something that's different from who you are and your experience. But if the light is shining on it just right and you're standing just in the right place, you can see yourself in that glass, reflected in that glass. So a book can also be a mirror of your own life and experience. The sliding glass door part was where you could open that door and go there and be part of that author's world. So that's the basics of the metaphor. And the data that the CCBC has in Madison about the numbers of books indicate, that forever, and this is something that people know, but being able to point to numbers, to the data, most books have been written by white people, and slowly there are increasing numbers of books written by people who are not white. And though that number is tiny, it is growing. And so children who are Native have books that mirror their identity in some way. And that's a big plus for them. Somebody was asking me about this morning. Is there proof? Because people always want proof. Can you prove that this is going to make a difference in a kid's life? And I'm like, we don't ask for proof for white kids. So what are we doing asking it here? That's a distraction. It's an assumption that we don't all need those mirrors, and we do. Everybody needs those mirrors. But anyway, I was thinking about that this morning. There was like there's proof. Can you prove that literature and history that's told honestly makes a difference in kids' lives? And I talk about the the Mexican American Studies program that was in Tucson. It was a program throughout the K through 12 system in Tucson that provided Latino kids with books and history that reflected them. And the studies that were done of that showed that those kids that were taking those courses came to school more often. So their attendance was better, their grades were better, and their graduation rates were better. So that's kind of like the evidence, I think, that books can make a difference in the life of a people. So anyway, the metaphor about books being able to do good for any reader is important.
You add to the metaphor with curtains.
Okay.
And I think that's such an interesting concept. You know, I've known about windows, mirrors, sliding glass doors for a long time, but your work adds this new concept of curtains.
When I was going to Alaska to do a presentation up there 15 years ago, no, maybe 10, I don't remember when, some time back, I was going to do a presentation and I was getting my slides ready and I was thinking about how can I use the metaphor in a way that's powerfully visual, engaging. And I thought, well, I grew up on a reservation. We have Pueblo houses. I'm going to look for a Pueblo house with a window in it. And so that's where I started. And I was looking at doing image searching in Google. And then I came to one and I said, well, that's our stuff. It was one of our community structures at Nambe. And I thought, that won't work. And I thought, wait. And I looked at that. It suddenly just clicked. There's a curtain on that window. And I know why that curtain is there because I grew up there. I know that we have curtains there because we've had too many instances historically, not just Pueblo people, but all Native people, of white ethnographers and researchers peeking in to our ceremonial spaces and not understanding what we are doing and writing about it in ways that were harmful to us. A lot of that writing led to government policies being passed that prohibited us from having our worship services in our traditional spiritual ways. So curtains are important because the outcome of that was that our elders taught us, you don't talk about this. You don't tell your teacher about this, because there was a very important need to protect our ways from being sacrilegious. All of that, the misinterpretation and the misunderstanding and the misrepresentation of Native life and ceremony has been so destructive. I protect that with my every fiber. And it's interesting to come across editors and teachers, readers, other people. They want the ceremony. They feel like if it's not there, then it's not really Native. And I say, do you need that for Catholic stuff too? Think of another religion that's more commonly experienced in the United States or somewhere. And do you feel the need to pry into that too? You don't, because you basically understand a respect for a people's religion. We need that too, because every human being on earth deserves that. That's a fundamental right. And so the curtains, bringing the curtains metaphor or extending Dr. Bishop's metaphor to include a curtain that would let me say, there's some things that people keep private for good reasons. And editors, if a Native person doesn't have this in their book, don't bother them about it, because that does happen too. They want that ceremony. They want that drumming. They want that dance. They want that feather. And Native writers are like, I don't want to. And if I did, that could have ramifications for me at my home.
Wow. Well, another one of your big themes in all of your work is that Native people are still here, as we touched on before. So I thought we would just talk about some of the amazing books that you've recommended recently. I grabbed a few that I've been able to read in the last month. So I'm just going to, I think, pull some out and we can talk about them. Or if there's other things that you want to talk about, I thought we'd just inspire our listeners to pick up some great books.
Well, I hope that you're going to reach for Sharice David's autobiographical picture book. Sharice's
I
big
didn't grab
voice.
that with me, but I know about
Okay.
it.
Because I think that one, when I think, earlier we were talking about that sliding glass door, and I, as I think about that, and I look at those lists of books, the ones that are appearing in greater number and frequency than any other body is LGBTQ plus books.
Right, that are on the banned list, yes.
Yes, that are on the banned list. And I think part of what's going on with that is that parents don't want that for their children. If their child is questioning their identity, they don't want that door to come open to that possibility of that's their identity. And so I think that's part of what's driving that, and the increasingly violent kinds of bills that are being proposed and passed. They hurt my heart for children. So anyway, Sharice's big voice, part of what you see in that book is that she says she's a lesbian. And she also talks about how at one point her people, she's from the Ho-Chunk Nation, her people are in 2 different states because of the American government's policies. So I think Moms for Liberty and No Left Turn, these groups, as soon as they read that book, they're going to say, okay, this one too, put it on the list. Because it's a mirror for Native children who are lesbian, or any children who are lesbian or gay. And it is also an honest depiction of history. And some of these moms think, well, they can learn that stuff later. Some of them think, no, they can't ever learn that. Anyway, it's a wonderful book, and it's one of those that might be called an intersectional book. Mm-hmm. That's also a very popular way of talking about books, the intersections across identity.
Yeah, there's a powerful image from that book I remember of
yes.
Sharice kind of pushing away homophobia, somebody with a speech bubble and a rainbow flag crossed out, and pushing away anti-native sentiment, and it's really powerful.
It is. Yeah, it is. I think it's a terrific book. Landmark.
Well, I just grabbed a few that touched me. One of them is On the Trap Line by David A. Robertson and illustrated by Julie Flett. David Robinson is a member of the Norway House Creek Nation. And this book is told from the first person of a grandson who's traveling with his grandfather. So many of the pages will just end with a new word defined. Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Are we talking about the new words are being, in particular, they're native words?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what I like about many of the newer books is that we are seeing native words in them with greater frequency. And those words are not placed in italics. That's a huge, a big step forward in terms of how words appear in children's books. And I don't know what's happening in the adult world, but in children's books, there's an understanding that using italics with a native word is a textual way of othering that language and those people that speak that language. So anyway, we stopped doing that. That's not happening very much anymore. I don't even think I can remember an example of it happening recently, that the words are just there without italics. And I think there are opportunities for people to know that those words and those languages are spoken today, in spite of all the efforts to kill the Indian and save the man. That was kill everything about being native. That was language, religion, dance, spirituality, all of those things. But we persist and survive. And so we see now more and more books that are open to native languages.
So I have a few more here I thought we could talk about. One is a recent chapter book I read, Jojo McCoon's. Tell us about this book, if you will. Okay,
so let's see. I went to school in like the 1960s. I guess I was in elementary school, and we had basal readers, those things that you learn to read in, and then we had the kinds of early chapter books, early reader books. So you had basals, and then you had ones not like it's hard for me to say this because an I can read or an easy reader of book. that you could read independently once you were learning words and you could start to be an independent reader. They were terrible. They were like Indian 2 feet, and I have a whole shelf of them in my office. There are really problematic books of that genre. And now, for the first time ever, we have a book like JoJo, where we have a native writer giving us a book for kids who are starting to be independent readers or well into that phase of their reading life. And it's a native kid in the present day. She's funny. She's witty. I like her very much.
Oh, yeah.
And gosh, if I'd have had a JoJo when I was in elementary school, that'd be great. So I'm really, really glad that we have JoJo now. And there's a sequel to JoJo that will be coming out soon. So I'm happy about that too.
Then I should say the author is Don Quigley, a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe, North Dakota.
Yes. And that's really important too, that what you just said, I don't know, I'm going to point it out because I pointed out, I think it's an important thing. You just said Don Quigley is a citizen, and you said the word is, and that's just like everybody saying the word is going to make a difference in how people think about Native people and how they think about us. Because the default is was, were. It's the past tense. And so when a teacher is using Jocho Macoons in a classroom, they can say, Dawn is. And that little word has so much power. And and the teacher can go on and say, she is, like you said, she's a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe. It's the same nation that Louise Erdrich is a member of. But anyway, a teacher can say, let's go look at their website. And so kids can use the internet to find that tribal nation's website. And that is so important because people think that we don't have technology. It's ludicrous, the kinds of things that we experience. But like when the National Museum of the American Indian opened in Washington, D.C., I was part of our tribal delegation there. And it was a big gathering. It was powerful. And the next day, the photos in the newspapers were like, Native people in traditional clothing on a cell phone. And it was like, they have cell phones. And it was like, hello, come on. That right there embodies all that's wrong with how society thinks about us.
Wow. Well, Debbie, as you're saying that, I'm realizing I didn't have you introduce yourself and your tribal citizenship.
All righty. I'm Debbie Reese. I'm from a small tribal nation in what is currently called the state of New Mexico. We're very deliberate. Some of us are very deliberate. It's a very political act to say currently known as the state of New Mexico because boundaries change, names change. These things are in flux. This is not a place that's going to stay the same place forever. That's just not. That's not the way the world works. So anyway, I'm from a small tribal nation in northern New Mexico. It's called Nambe Owinge. Those are both Tewa words. My tribal name, actually, the name that I was given in a ceremony, because people get names in ceremonies no matter what people they're from, whether it's a parent giving their child their grandmother's name or names matter. Anyway, so I have Debbie is my the name my parents gave me, but my grandmother gave me a Tewa name that's Poset Pokui, and I don't use that. I recently started adding it to my social media. And I'm thinking about, why do I not? Well, because it's hard for people to pronounce it. And like, yeah, but they learn how to speak Klingon. Nothing is beyond reach. It's the emotional response that we have to things that needs to shift and just be more open and embracing to people who are from different cultures, places.
I also wanted to talk about Ni Alisi, or Look Grandma. This is a book sort of like we were talking about that has a native language and English together in the title there. And it's a really interesting book because it has a native character, present day, but it's really sort of a math book. And I'll say the author is Art Colson, who is Cherokee from Oklahoma.
Yeah, I like that book a lot because when I was a teacher, in some of the years that I spent teaching, I worked specifically in math with elementary kids in math. So I like that book because we need books that depict Native people in a range of circumstances, primarily ones that are set in the present day, but ones that show us as people of unique cultures and unique languages, and that have that as part of the everyday things that we do. And so in this case, his grandma is part of his life, his everyday life, and she's going to sell at a gathering, and she's got a table where she's going to do that. So that's the kind of experience a lot of families in the United States have, that they have there's a art fair coming up or something, and their grandmother's getting ready to go to that art fair. Well, in this case, it's a Cherokee Nation gathering, and his grandmother is going to sell some things, and he's been creating these marbles which are rooted in Cherokee story and history, and he wants to sell those. And his grandma says, okay, but this is real, right? Grandmas can't give you the whole table. Grandma's got to make money too. So grandma says, this is how much space you get. And then it's his job to figure out how he's going to sell his marbles in that much space. So it's a great volume.
Yes, it's about volume. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing. Well, I thought I'd bring a couple teen books that I really liked. One is Apple Skin to the Core by Eric Gansworth, which is in verse investigating so many different things from Apple Music to the term Apple, which the book here says is a slur in Native communities across the country, someone who's supposedly red on the outside, white on the inside. Eric Gansworth is an enrolled Onaganda writer and visual artist. And then also, I really loved #NotYourPrincess, which collects voices of Native American women. It is poetry, art, and other writings that, again, is just very contemporary in the real world.
Yes, that's a terrific book. And when next time you pick up We Are Water Protectors by Carol Lindstrom and Michaela Goad, that final page spread there has a hashtag on one of the signs, because that's another, there you got it. That's another way to signal to people, we're with it. We use hashtags. We organize around Twitter hashtags. So one of the signs on one of the characters is carrying has the hashtag on it. And I think it's down there. That's it. Right there.
Yes. Yeah. I'm holding the book here, and we have #NoDAPL for the pipeline. The book with the hashtag in the title, that's a great book, and I hope people pick that up, because a book like that, they can learn many different writers and artists and look for that work elsewhere. So it provides many openings to explore other places. And Eric, he grew up and I grew up at different ends of the country, but on reservations, and we're near the same age. And it is remarkable to me how similar some of the experiences we had as kids going to school are. And so when I read his books, they touch me in ways that books by Native writers who are living in urban areas don't. So I especially like his books for that reason, that they're very reservation based and yet very much part of a modern life. Well, are there any other favorites that you want to recommend to our audience?
Well, I think one that I'm thinking of in particular, and I already spoke about it because it's very much on my mind because of the bandings, is Sherese's Big Voice. So I hope people will pick that up. I also have been thinking about Tracy Sorrell's book about Mary Golda Ross. She was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and she was an engineer. And she started out like in the 1920s, really liked math and science, and that's what she chose to do, was study math and science. And she ended up being an engineer at Lockheed, in becoming part of a secret Lockheed project that had to do with designing aircraft. We don't know about her. Now we will because of Tracy's book, but part of why we don't know about her is because of the Cherokee values that guided her life, and those are in the book. They talk about, Tracy Sorrell, the author, who is Cherokee, put that in the opening pages of the book, that humility is a fundamental part of what it means to be Cherokee. And so this woman did not talk about herself and her work. And so now we can finally have a book about that because Tracy recognizes the importance of having, and it's the math again, like Art Colson's book, that the significance of that book and of Sharice's book and Art's book for me are that so much of American society expects us to be artists and drummers and storytellers and singers. Yeah. But we are lawyers. My daughter's a lawyer. My daughter's now a professor. But we are everything. And that needs to be something that people know, because when we're not conforming to an expectation, then we are rejected. And that's just wrong.
Yeah. Well, since you brought up your daughter, I have to say you've talked a lot about Jingle Dancer over the years, which I think came out 20 years ago or something. But you've said it's a book you wish you would have had for your kids. And there is a character, again, this is set in a contemporary time, who is a lawyer, a cousin who just appears on the side. And it's, again, very normal that she's a lawyer. So.
And that book is very significant to us because it is. I do wish I had that book when my daughter was doing a traditional dance for the first time. We created the stories. We just drew pictures, stick figures, because I'm no artist. But so we have those little things that we put together ourselves. But it would have been nice to have that picture book because it's exactly what Pueblo kids do too. You go with your family and they help you to learn what you're going to do for the particular gathering or dance. So I wished I had it back then for my daughter because she experienced those same things when she danced for the first time. Now, fast forward to present day, my daughter is that lawyer who can't go home because she's working on something. And so that book has a journey in our life that I don't think anything will ever be like that for us.
Wow. Well, you've really, I think, just shown us how important literature can be in all of our lives. I've learned so much from you in this conversation and over the years, and it's such a joy to meet you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
You can find Dr. Debbie Reese's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young People, here at the library in our podcast collection and teen collection. Her blog, American Indians in Children's Literature, is at americanindiansinchildren'sliterature.blogspot.com, and a link will be in our show notes and blog post for this episode. In the show notes and blog post, you can also find a list of all the books we recommended in our conversation, with links to them in our library's catalog. That's our show. A special thank you to Dr. Reese for taking the time to talk with us, and thank you for listening to our 53rd interview episode. Also, a special thank you to our youth services staff at the library, as well as Elisa Gall for their additional help in making this episode possible. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast@deerfieldlibrary.org. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website or in our show notes. Thanks for listening.